March 23, 1945, near the Rhine River, Germany. Wehrmacht intelligence officer Hauptmann Friedrich Vollmer studied reconnaissance photographs with growing alarm. The photos showed a massive American armored division, the 9th Armored, massing near the river. Hundreds of tanks, artillery pieces, supply vehicles, thousands of troops preparing for what appeared to be a major assault across the Rhine. Vollmer immediately reported to his superiors. German forces rushed to reinforce the sector. They repositioned artillery, moved infantry battalions, prepared defensive positions. Every available resource in the region was concentrated to stop the expected American armored assault. But when German reconnaissance patrols finally reached the American positions for closer observation, they found something impossible. The tanks were rubber inflatables. The artillery pieces were painted wood. The supply trucks were canvas over frames. The division of thousands of soldiers was actually about 1,500 men, with speakers playing sound effects of tanks and trucks. The entire American 9th Armored Division that Vollmer had photographed didn't exist. It was an illusion created by artists, designers, sound engineers, and actors, soldiers who carried paintbrushes instead of rifles, who fought with creativity instead of weapons, and who would help end the conflict while remaining classified for nearly 50 years. This is the story of the Ghost Army, the most unusual unit in American military history, and how a collection of artists pulled off deceptions so successful that even 70 years later, military planners study their techniques. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was activated in January 1944, though its true purpose wasn't revealed to most recruits initially. The unit was officially described as a headquarters unit that would support larger operations. What recruits didn't know was that they were being selected for something unprecedented, an entire military unit dedicated to deception. The concept emerged from a simple military reality. In modern warfare, knowing where enemy forces are concentrated determines where you attack and where you defend. If you can deceive the enemy about your force's location and strength, you gain enormous tactical advantage. But deception at scale, making the enemy believe entire divisions exist where they don't, had never been attempted systematically. American military planners studying British deception operations in North Africa realized that modern war created opportunities for sophisticated deception. Aerial reconnaissance, radio intelligence, and ground observation all provided information, but all could be manipulated if you understood how the enemy gathered intelligence. The challenge was finding personnel who could execute this kind of deception. You needed people who understood visual design, who could create convincing illusions, who had technical skills with sound and radio equipment. Where does the military find such people? Art schools. Recruiters visited art schools and design programs across America with an unusual pitch. Your country needs your creativity. They recruited painters, sculptors, designers, architects, illustrators, sound engineers, and radio operators. They recruited men who had been considered unsuitable for combat roles because of physical limitations or lack of traditional military skills, but who had creative abilities the military desperately needed. Among the recruits was Bill Blass, who would become one of America's most famous fashion designers. There was Ellsworth Kelly, who would become a celebrated minimalist painter. Art Kane, who would revolutionize photography. These weren't professional soldiers. They were artists who happened to be in uniform. The unit assembled at Camp Forest, Tennessee, in early 1944 for training. What they discovered was that they weren't training for traditional military operations. They were learning to inflate rubber tanks that looked realistic from aerial reconnaissance. They were studying how to create sound effects that mimicked tank and truck movements. They were practicing radio deception, sending fake traffic that enemy signals intelligence would intercept. The equipment was ingenious. The inflatable tanks were made of rubber and canvas, could be inflated by hand pumps or small compressors, and from aerial reconnaissance or distant ground observation, looked identical to real Sherman tanks. They weighed about 60 pounds deflated, light enough for 2 men to carry. Inflated, they looked like 30-ton armored vehicles. The sound equipment was even more sophisticated. Engineers had recorded actual tank columns, truck convoys and troop movements, then created playback systems that could project these sounds over long distances. Speakers mounted on vehicles could make it seem like an entire armored division was moving through an area when it was really just a few trucks with sound equipment. The radio deception was perhaps the most complex element. Every military unit generates radio traffic, communications between headquarters and field units, supply requests, status reports. Enemy signals intelligence units monitor this traffic to track unit locations and activities. The Ghost Army's radio operators learned to mimic the communication patterns of real divisions, creating convincing fake radio traffic that enemy intelligence would intercept and believe. But what made the Ghost Army truly effective wasn't just equipment, it was the artistic sensibility the soldiers brought. They understood that successful deception required attention to detail that went beyond military precision. It required understanding how things should look and sound and feel. For example, a real tank division doesn't just have tanks. It has supply vehicles, maintenance equipment, command posts, latrines, mess facilities. The Ghost Army learned to create entire fake installations with all these supporting elements. They would paint signs, create fake tire tracks, hang laundry, even set up fake mess halls with smoke from cooking fires. They were creating theatrical sets that could fool aerial reconnaissance and ground observation. In June 1944, the Ghost Army shipped to England as the Allied invasion of France approached. They still didn't know exactly how they would be used, just that their unique skills would be needed for the invasion's success. Their first major operation came after D-Day, as Allied forces pushed inland from the Normandy beaches. The operation was codenamed Operation Elephant and took place near Normandy in July 1944. The goal was to make German forces believe that a major American armored assault would come from one direction when the actual attack would come from another. The Ghost Army moved into position and began their illusion. They inflated rubber tanks and positioned them to be visible to German aerial reconnaissance. They set up fake command posts with radio equipment broadcasting convincing traffic. They used sound equipment to simulate tank and vehicle movements. They even had soldiers drive around the area in jeeps dragging chains and using other techniques to create dust and tire tracks consistent with heavy vehicle movement. The deception worked. German forces reinforced the fake attack zone, while the real American assault came from a different direction with much lighter opposition. The operation was considered a success, though at that point, even Allied commanders weren't entirely convinced that tactical deception at this scale was worth the resources. What changed commanders' minds was Operation Brest in August 1944. The port city of Brest was heavily defended by German forces. Allied planners needed to convince the Germans that the assault on Brest would be larger than it actually was, hoping to either draw German reinforcements away from other sectors or convince Brest's defenders that resistance was futile. The Ghost Army created the illusion of two full divisions preparing to assault Brest. They established fake command posts, inflated hundreds of rubber tanks and vehicles, broadcast intensive radio traffic, and used sound equipment to simulate massive troop and equipment concentrations. German intelligence intercepted the radio traffic and received reconnaissance reports of the tank concentrations. They believed they were facing a force 3 times larger than actually existed. When the real assault began, German defenders, convinced they were outnumbered, offered less resistance than they might have otherwise. Brest fell to Allied forces with fewer casualties than projected. Post-battle analysis suggested the deception had been a significant factor in the victory. From that point forward, Allied command became enthusiastic supporters of Ghost Army operations. But here's what the Ghost Army soldiers were experiencing that commanders didn't fully appreciate. These weren't traditional combat soldiers, and they weren't in traditional danger, but they were operating very close to front lines, often ahead of actual combat units to establish deceptions before attacks. They were unarmed or lightly armed, carrying art supplies and inflatable tanks instead of weapons. If German forces had discovered what they were doing, if a patrol had stumbled upon soldiers inflating rubber tanks or discovered the sound equipment, the Ghost Army soldiers would have been captured or worse. There's evidence suggesting that German forces, if they had understood the deception, might have considered Ghost Army operations illegal under conventions of warfare and treated captured deception units as spies rather than soldiers. The Ghost Army operated under this tension constantly. They were close enough to enemy lines to be in danger, doing work that required concentration and precision, knowing that discovery could mean not just capture, but potential execution as spies. One incident in France illustrated the danger. A Ghost Army unit was setting up a fake tank park when a German patrol approached unexpectedly. The Ghost Army soldiers, with minimal weapons, had to quickly deflate and hide the inflatable tanks, while a small group of actual combat soldiers attached to the unit engaged the German patrol. The fight was brief but intense. The Germans were driven off, but the Ghost Army realized how vulnerable they were. After that incident, Ghost Army units traveled with small infantry protection details, but this created its own problem. Too many real soldiers defending a fake unit might make observers suspicious. Too few soldiers meant vulnerability. The balance was constantly difficult. As Allied forces pushed across France toward Germany in late 1944, the Ghost Army executed increasingly sophisticated operations. Operation Viersen in March 1945 was their most complex and successful deception. The actual objective was for the 9th Armored Division to cross the Rhine River at one location. The deception was to make German forces believe the 9th Armored was preparing to cross at a completely different location, 15 miles away. The Ghost Army moved into the fake crossing area and created one of the most elaborate illusions of the war. They didn't just inflate tanks. They created an entire staging area for a river crossing. Fake bridging equipment, fake supply dumps, fake command posts, extensive radio traffic coordinating fake units, sound effects of construction and vehicle movements, even fake soldiers, mannequins dressed in uniforms positioned where they'd be visible to distant observation. The artistic soldiers paid attention to details that traditional military planners might have missed. They knew that a real staging area would have certain patterns, where soldiers would walk, where vehicles would be parked, where supplies would be stored. They recreated these patterns. They even had soldiers drive vehicles around following routes that would create tire track patterns consistent with genuine operations. German intelligence noticed the activity. Reconnaissance flights photographed the installations. Radio intelligence intercepted the communications. Ground observers reported vehicle and troop movements. Everything pointed to the 9th Armored, preparing to cross the Rhine at the fake location. German forces reinforced that sector heavily. Artillery was repositioned to cover the expected crossing point. Infantry units moved into defensive positions. The Germans were preparing to destroy the 9th Armored when they attempted the crossing. On March 23, 1945, the 9th Armored crossed the Rhine, 15 miles away from where Germans expected. The crossing faced much lighter resistance than it would have if German forces hadn't been deceived. The operation was a significant success, and post-conflict analysis suggested the Ghost Army's deception had saved hundreds, possibly thousands, of American lives. But there's a darker element to this success that wasn't widely discussed. The German soldiers who had been deceived and repositioned to defend the fake crossing point were now out of position when the real crossing occurred. Some rushed to engage the actual American forces and were caught in difficult tactical situations, attacking forces that were already established rather than defending prepared positions. German casualties were higher because of the deception. This raises an ethical question that Ghost Army soldiers grappled with. Was deceiving enemies into vulnerable positions fundamentally different from attacking them directly? Were casualties inflicted through deception morally distinct from casualties inflicted through combat? The Ghost Army soldiers had volunteered to save American lives through creativity rather than violence. But their creativity was still causing casualties, just indirectly. Some soldiers found this troubling. They had thought they were avoiding the moral weight of combat by joining a deception unit. Instead, they discovered they were contributing to enemy casualties through their art. One Ghost Army soldier, interviewed years later, described this realization. "I joined because I didn't want to be responsible for taking lives. Then I realized our deceptions were getting German soldiers positioned where they could be attacked more effectively. We were contributing to their deaths with paintbrushes and inflatable tanks. It wasn't what I expected when I enlisted." As the conflict moved into its final months in early 1945, the Ghost Army executed operation after operation. They created fake divisions, fake headquarters, fake supply concentrations. They projected sounds of armor where no armor existed. They broadcast radio traffic suggesting operations that weren't happening. They became extraordinarily proficient at military theater. But they were also exhausted. The work was mentally demanding in ways combat wasn't. Combat soldiers could rely on training and instinct. Ghost Army soldiers had to think constantly about how their deceptions would appear to observers, whether details were convincing, whether they'd missed something that would reveal the illusion. Additionally, they weren't receiving recognition. Combat units that succeeded in battles received commendations and publicity. The Ghost Army's operations were classified. They couldn't discuss what they did, couldn't receive public recognition, couldn't even fully explain to other soldiers why they were inflating rubber tanks near the front lines. Some combat soldiers who saw Ghost Army operations assumed they were cowards hiding behind fake equipment. The Ghost Army couldn't correct this misunderstanding without revealing classified operations. They had to accept being seen as strange or cowardly by soldiers who didn't understand what they were actually doing. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Ghost Army had executed approximately 20 major operations across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. They'd created illusions that had deceived German intelligence repeatedly. They'd contributed to Allied victories while suffering minimal casualties themselves. Only a few Ghost Army soldiers were lost during the entire European campaign, mostly from accidents or being in wrong places at wrong times. Post-conflict military analysis suggested the Ghost Army's operations had drawn German forces away from actual attack points in ways that reduced American casualties by potentially 15,000 to 30,000 soldiers. The exact number is impossible to calculate because we can't know how battles would have gone without the deceptions, but the impact was substantial. Despite this success, the Ghost Army was immediately classified after the conflict ended. Soldiers were told they couldn't discuss their service, couldn't explain what they'd done, had to tell families and friends they'd been in a special unit without providing details. The equipment was hidden away, the records were sealed. The unit's existence was classified. Why the secrecy? Military planners wanted to preserve the possibility of using similar deception tactics in future conflicts. If enemies knew how the deceptions worked, they'd be less effective. So the Ghost Army story was suppressed. This created a strange situation. Soldiers who had served honorably and effectively, who had used their creative skills to save thousands of lives, couldn't receive recognition. They returned to civilian life unable to explain what they'd done during the conflict. Many went into art and design careers: Bill Blass in fashion, Ellsworth Kelly in painting, Art Kane in photography, and achieved fame in those fields. But they couldn't discuss the most unusual thing they'd ever done. The secrecy lasted until 1996, 51 years after the conflict ended. The Ghost Army was finally declassified as part of routine review of World War II records. Suddenly, surviving Ghost Army soldiers could tell their story. They were in their 70s and 80s by then, and many had already passed away, never being able to discuss their service. When the story became public, there was immediate recognition that something remarkable had been missed. Military historians realized that an entire dimension of Allied strategy had been omitted from conflict histories. Artistic communities discovered that some of their most celebrated members had conducted military deception operations. The general public learned that inflatable tanks and sound effects had played significant roles in Allied victory. Rick Beyer, a filmmaker, became fascinated with the Ghost Army story and spent years documenting it. He interviewed surviving soldiers, gathered photographs and documents, and created a documentary in 2013 titled The Ghost Army. The film brought wider attention to the unit's story. What emerged from survivor interviews was that Ghost Army soldiers had complex feelings about their service. They were proud of having contributed to Allied victory and saved lives, but many felt conflicted about the deception aspect. They'd thought they were avoiding combat's moral complications by using creativity instead of weapons. They discovered that deception carried its own moral weight. There was also frustration about the secrecy. These soldiers had done something remarkable and hadn't been allowed to discuss it for half a century. Friends and family had sometimes thought their service wasn't significant because they couldn't explain what they'd done. Some had been dismissed as having had easy wartime experiences because they weren't in traditional combat roles. One particular frustration involved benefits and recognition. Combat soldiers received certain veterans' benefits and decorations. Ghost Army soldiers received minimal recognition because their operations were classified. After declassification, some survivors sought appropriate recognition, but many had already passed away. In 2013, surviving Ghost Army soldiers were awarded Congressional Gold Medals, one of the nation's highest civilian honors. The ceremony recognized their unique contribution to victory. But by 2013, only a handful of Ghost Army soldiers were still alive to receive the recognition. Most had passed away during the decades of enforced secrecy. The Ghost Army's legacy raises interesting questions about warfare, art, and deception. Military academies now study Ghost Army operations in courses on tactical deception. The techniques developed in 1944-1945 informed Cold War deception operations and continue influencing modern military planning around information operations. But there's also an artistic legacy. The idea that creativity could be weaponized, that art and design skills had direct military value, influenced how some artists thought about their work. Several Ghost Army veterans said their wartime experience taught them that visual communication could change reality. If you could convince people something existed or didn't exist through visual means, you had real power. The equipment used by the Ghost Army is now displayed in museums. Surviving inflatable tanks, sound equipment, and photographs of operations show the creativity and technical sophistication involved. Standing next to a deflated rubber tank that once convinced German intelligence they were facing armored divisions is a surreal experience. What's particularly striking is how low-tech the deception was. In an era now dominated by digital manipulation and sophisticated information operations, the Ghost Army used rubber, canvas, paint, and sound recordings. They succeeded through attention to detail and understanding of human perception, not through advanced technology. Modern military deception operations are far more sophisticated, involving electronic warfare, cyber operations, and advanced signal manipulation. But military planners still study the Ghost Army because the fundamental principle remains the same. If you understand how your enemy gathers and interprets information, you can manipulate that information to create false reality. There's also a cautionary element to the Ghost Army story. The success of deception operations depends on enemies believing their intelligence. Once an enemy becomes aware of deception tactics, they become less effective. This is why the Ghost Army was classified so long. Preserving the potential for future deception required keeping the method secret. But there's an ethical dimension that shouldn't be ignored. The Ghost Army's deceptions directly contributed to German casualties by positioning German forces where they could be attacked more effectively. This was the intent: reduce American casualties by creating tactical advantages through deception. But it means that these artistic soldiers, who thought they were avoiding combat's moral complications, were actually involved in causing casualties, just indirectly. Some Ghost Army veterans were troubled by this realization. Others rationalized that war inherently involves trying to defeat the enemy and deception that reduces your own casualties while increasing enemy casualties is legitimate. Still others felt that deception was morally superior to direct violence because it achieved military objectives while giving enemies opportunities to surrender or withdraw when they realized they'd been deceived. There's no clear answer to these ethical questions. War creates moral ambiguity, and the Ghost Army's experience illustrates that even non-violent military roles involve moral complexity. The individual stories of Ghost Army soldiers reveal the human dimension of this unusual unit. Bill Blass, the future fashion designer, spent the conflict inflating rubber tanks in France. His artistic eye for detail made him valuable for creating convincing installations. After the conflict, he rarely discussed his service, partly because it was classified and partly because it was so unusual that people wouldn't have believed him. Ellsworth Kelly, who became a major figure in minimalist art, said his Ghost Army experience influenced his artistic development. The need to create convincing illusions with minimal elements aligned with his later aesthetic of reduction to essential forms. He couldn't discuss this influence publicly until after declassification, because explaining where he developed these ideas would have required revealing classified information. Art Kane revolutionized fashion photography with innovative techniques that he later attributed to his Ghost Army experience. Creating illusions that could fool aerial reconnaissance taught him how visual perception could be manipulated, knowledge he applied to photography. These were just a few of approximately 100 soldiers who served in the Ghost Army during the conflict. Most didn't become famous artists. They returned to ordinary civilian jobs, commercial artists, illustrators, designers, teachers. But they all carried this secret. They had conducted military deception operations that influenced major battles, and they couldn't discuss it for 5 decades. When the story finally became public in 1996, one Ghost Army veteran described feeling relief. For 50 years, people asked what I did in the conflict, and I had to give vague answers. My family thought I'd done something embarrassing or cowardly because I wouldn't explain. Finally, being able to say I was in a deception unit that created fake armies to fool German intelligence was incredibly liberating. People thought I was making it up at first, but eventually they understood. The Ghost Army's story has inspired contemporary artists who see parallels between their tactical deception and modern art practices. The idea that creating convincing illusions could have real-world impact, that artistic skills had military value, resonates with artists who want their work to matter beyond aesthetic appreciation. There have been exhibitions of Ghost Army art and documentation bringing their story to wider audiences. Museums have acquired surviving equipment and records. The story has been incorporated into World War II histories that had previously omitted this dimension of Allied operations. But there's still something poignant about the recognition coming so late. The Ghost Army executed approximately 20 major deception operations between June 1944 and May 1945. They contributed to Allied victory in concrete, measurable ways. They saved potentially tens of thousands of American lives through successful deceptions, and they couldn't discuss any of it for 51 years. They watched as combat units received recognition and celebration. They endured misunderstandings about their service. They carried this secret through their entire adult lives until most had already passed away. The surviving Ghost Army soldiers who were finally able to tell their story expressed mixed feelings. Relief at recognition, but sadness that it came so late. Pride in their service, but frustration about the decades of secrecy. Satisfaction that their story was finally public, but awareness that most of their comrades hadn't lived to share it. Today, the Ghost Army story is taught in military courses, studied by historians, and appreciated by artists. The inflatable tanks that once deceived German intelligence are now museum exhibits. The sound recordings that once mimicked armored divisions are historical documents. The radio deception techniques are studied in signals intelligence courses. The legacy is that 100 artists and designers used creativity instead of violence to contribute to military victory. They proved that military effectiveness isn't just about firepower and aggression, but also about intelligence, deception, and understanding how enemies perceive reality. They carried paintbrushes, not rifles, sound equipment, not machine guns, inflatable tanks, not real armor, and they saved approximately 30,000 lives through successful deception operations that remained classified for half a century. Remember the Ghost Army. Remember that warfare has dimensions beyond direct violence. Remember that creativity can be as powerful as weapons. Remember that artists contributed to Allied victory not despite their artistic skills, but because of them. And remember that sometimes the most effective way to fight is not to fight at all, but to make enemies believe they're fighting something that doesn't exist, to create illusions so convincing that real military decisions are made based on false reality. The Ghost Army created false reality so successfully that German forces reinforced positions where no threats existed, while actual American forces achieved objectives with reduced opposition. They won battles without firing shots. They saved thousands of lives through successful deception. And they did it with rubber tanks, sound effects, and artistic attention to detail that convinced German intelligence they were facing divisions that existed only in imagination. That's the power of art weaponized. The Ghost Army's strange, remarkable, and long classified contribution to Allied victory in the Second World War.